Hello again, Jeff Spees for our third discussion about issues surrounding end of life. I appreciate you joining me again. I hope that you found the handouts. If you've made your way to the website and you're seeing the videos, then the link to the handouts is on that same page on the Trinity website. The handouts include URLs and live links to references, and we'll be using some of those today also. So let's just review where we've been. We started this conversation with the Dean's Forum from Trinity Cathedral, conversation with Dean Owens on November 15th, and I will put a disclaimer here, is that I'm recording these video sessions before we've had the Dean's Forum, so I don't know what we talked about. Our first session was on advanced care planning with some additional information about how the pandemic affects that. Our second session was on suffering and some controversial options at the end of life. Today, we're going to scratch the surface of religion and spirituality at the intersection with the dying process or the end of life. I hope through one of these four conversations that we've at least piqued a little bit of interest, and that we can then have some give and take, which will unfortunately necessarily be held over Zoom. And I hope that you will think about, if you have a particular question that you want to make sure gets addressed at a Zoom session, feel free to email it to me. There's my email address right there, and it also is on the handout. Because sometimes if there are factual questions, I might need to do a little bit of homework to make sure that I have the answer right. So for today, religion and spirituality at the end of life. This is a gigantic topic, and we will barely scratch the surface. And I thoroughly expect to provide a whole lot more questions than I do answers. What I'd like to do today is to discuss a little bit of what we mean by these terms, religion and spirituality, at least how I look at them. We will go through three different studies that show little bits of what happens in the interaction between religion, spirituality, and end of life, particularly end of life choices. We'll run through a little bit about what our tradition has to say, although this will be remarkably superficial, and then to talk a bit about spiritual pain and healing from it. Okay, so first, what do we mean by terms? Well, the term religion. In my Webster's Dictionary, religion is defined as the belief in a divine or superhuman power or powers to be obeyed and worshiped as creator and ruler of the universe, an expression of such a belief in conduct and ritual. Those who study this intersection of religion and spirituality at the end of life have had to come up with a little more researchy, a little more measurable definition. And one operational research definition puts religion as an organized system of beliefs, practices, and symbols designed to facilitate closeness to the transcendent or the divine and foster an understanding of one's relationship and responsibilities with others living in community. I like that because it adds the outward community as part of what religion means. The Webster definition is totally a personal definition. So that's generally what a couple of definitions for religion. You may have your own. Spirituality. Well, Webster's dictionary doesn't really help much. Webster's defines spirituality as spiritual character, quality, or nature. Well, my sixth grade teacher would say you can't define a word using itself in the definition. So what does Webster say spiritual is? Spiritual is of the spirit or the soul as distinguished from the body or material matters. And again, that doesn't help much. The researchers, I think, have come a little closer. In 2009, there was a consensus conference of researchers into spirituality. And they define spirituality as the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. I've collected a few quick definitions from some hospice workers. One is that spirituality is a path away from the superficial and into the depths, or that spirituality is the journey of the soul, or an awareness of our sacred connection with all of life. And I particularly like this definition of spirituality from a former hospice social worker who's an avowed atheist, who says spirituality is what makes your heart sing. These are my definitions, and these are just taken from my book. And I put the definition of spirituality first. And these are just my personal thoughts. I'm not just putting them out there. That spirituality refers to the interior life, the search for personal identity and how one is related to the cosmos, to the transcendent, to the divine. And that religion defines, categorizes, and codifies that search and that life using sacred texts, stories, teachings, and rituals. But somehow, anyway, in the end of life world, we think of spirituality as that inner life, that inner part of us that can manifest in many ways. And that religion is one way in which that spirituality, that spiritual search can be expressed and manifested. Okay. So there's definitions for what they're worth. Now I'd like to look at the intersection of spirituality and the end of life. So the spiritual is that part of us that seeks answers and seeks meaning. It's that part of us that yearns for the peace that we mean when we say a peaceful death. That spirituality is uniquely personal and therefore is profoundly difficult to measure. So in session 2, when we talked about suffering, I pointed out that researchers into suffering have had to substitute measurable quantities for suffering because it is virtually impossible to measure suffering. And the same thing is true with regard to spirituality, so that most researchers have limited questions and measures to either religion, religious affiliation, or religiosity, which means how much do you practice your religion, or how important is your religion to you. So that although we're going to go through 3 studies looking at the intersection of spirituality and the end of life, we have to be certain to say that that's not what we're measuring. we might be measuring something related to it. I hope so. So let's look at 3 different studies. So this was a study that was published in 2008 in a surgery journal. And this was a survey, a random dialing survey that ended up with 1,006 Americans from across the country over the age of 18. And the investigators were trauma surgeons and trauma staff. And they were asking preferences about questions about preference for care if you were seriously injured or potentially fatally injured, or your ideas about the care that someone you love should receive should they have been similarly injured. And there were lots of questions, and the religion spirituality piece is just a snippet from this study. If you want the whole study, there's the link, and the URL and an active link, like I said, is in the handout. So one question they asked was, how important would your religious beliefs be in guiding decisions about your own medical care if you were critically injured? And you remember, this is random dialed Americans in 2008. And you can see that 2/3 of them said that their religious beliefs would be either somewhat or very much important in deciding, in making decisions about their own care. With regard to a family member, if the doctors treating your family member said futility had been reached, in other words, there was nothing more that could be done to save the life of your family member, would you believe that divine intervention by God could save your family member? And you could see that a strong majority said yes. Now, I think that the only value of this study is as a snapshot of American thought, that religion is important in guiding decisions, and that the idea of the miraculous or the divine intervention is certainly not absent from our minds. Okay. Positive religious coping. So this is a research construct that has been used in quite a few studies by quite a few researchers. And the concept of positive religious coping as a characteristic that can be measured is the beneficial use of faith in dealing with adversity, particularly illness and death. Negative religious coping is a much rarer entity, such as blaming God for, or believing you are being punished, and that is not seen as a healthy thing. But positive religious coping, the beneficial use of faith in dealing with adversity, particularly illness and death. One simple example, I rely on God's love and care to get me through times of crisis. As I mentioned, this is common, and it's a generally successful defense or coping strategy. It's been shown over and over that people going through cancer treatment who can rely on their religious faith as a successful way of getting them through what they're going through. Positive religious coping is usually viewed as a healthy form of psychological adaptation. Okay, so this is nothing unexpected. And this kind of fits with my preconceptions. When I got into, as I transitioned into more and more end-of-life care, I was awakened to something. I had always assumed because I grew up in a very religious household in a very active church. And I heard what was said, and we'll come back to what the tradition teaches in a minute. And I assumed that people who were strongly religious would be more at peace at the end of their lives and would be looking forward to transitioning to heaven, and that holding on to this life was perhaps not something that they would do, that there would be less suffering, more peace. And I've certainly seen plenty of those patients, the little old lady who reads her Bible every day and just falls asleep and is happy to wake up in heaven. That's a tremendous image. It turns out, though, that that isn't really the case. And lots of studies have gotten at this, and I'd like to go through one. This was published in 2009, and this is a multi-site study from several institutions across the United States that recruited patients with advanced and worsening cancer. These are people whose disease was threatening their lives and likely to take their lives. And in order to participate, they needed an identifiable spouse or caregiver that was actively involved in their care. And there were 345 patient caregiver dyads that were reported on. And the investigators were looking at several psychosocial and religious spiritual measures, along with advanced care planning, end-of-life preferences, what people thought about things like that. So these patients and their caregivers were interviewed at the start of the study that they agreed to participate in. Excuse me. And they were asked how they coped with their illness and the impending end of life with the measures that I just mentioned. And then the researchers just let things go, and they kept track of them mainly so that they could come back and reassess. And then after the patient died, the researchers reviewed the records to see what had happened, what choices had been made, whether, since there were questions about advanced care planning, whether advanced care plans were enacted, what happened. And then they also interviewed the surviving spouse or caregiver to ask what that dying process had been like, what had happened, and what had it been like. And again, there were lots of parts to this, but this was the thrust of this paper, that those with the highest levels of positive religious coping, and these are the patients that identified this, were more likely to acknowledge that their disease was terminal, and they were more likely to say that their spiritual needs were being supported. So this fits with what we think. So these people, very religious, they have a strong faith, they know they are dying, and they feel their spiritual needs are being supported. So what kind of choices did they make? What kind of care did they receive? Well, these patients received intensive care aimed at prolonging their life 3 times as often as those who had lower levels of positive religious coping. And in this population, remember, these are patients with advancing cancer and that is threatening their life. As it turned out, the median survival of these patients from first interview to death was about 4 months. So in this population, this very ill population, intensive care, going on ventilators, dialysis, pressors, are painful, they add significant symptoms, they add a tremendous expense, and they almost never work. It doesn't keep people alive longer. In fact, there are some suggestions in some studies that people may live less in these situations like that. So these same people who were more likely to say, yeah, I know I'm dying, and yes, I feel at peace, were scratched and clawed to keep their physical life going. Several hospice chaplains have told me in words that are similar, but this is just one quote, is that the religious but not too spiritual suffer the most at the end of life. We may try and unpack that just a little bit. Okay. So why might this be? This seems like a disconnect to me. Well, this is another study that was published in 2013, and this was in older Americans. In this study, patients were recruited from 2 New Jersey hospital clinics and a New Jersey cancer center. These were patients who were over 55 years of age. And this was part of something that was called the New Jersey End of Life Study. And for this part of the study, these patients were asked about their advanced care plans, some of their values, their religious affiliation, and the importance of their religion or their spirituality to them. There were several belief statements that they were asked about. So this was a survey of these patients. They all were recruited from, and they were all had advanced disease. They didn't all have cancer. Most of them had advanced colorectal cancer, but some had heart failure or other serious medical illnesses that were threatening their lives. So what did they find? Well, they found that conservative Protestants, remember they asked about religious affiliation, and those placing great importance on religion and spirituality, whatever their religious affiliation was, had a lower likelihood of advanced care planning. Well, this fits with what the previous study showed, is that those who place great importance, who have a high level of positive religious coping, have a lower likelihood of making advanced care plans. There's a clue in the conservative Protestants, I think, and that might be the religious but not too spiritual, but that's probably too broad of a brush. And this was 355 patients, so there may have been other groups that would have filtered out if they had more patients and a higher powered study. But the reason that these groups had a lower level of advanced care planning sorted out to the fact of who's in control. Those associations were largely accounted for by the belief that God controls how long we live. And therefore the value of using all available treatments. So flip on, what does our tradition teach? Well, I've got quite a few little pieces, and you'll have to excuse me while I dropped my notes on the floor and I'm digging out something I'm going to need to read in a few minutes here. What does the tradition teach? Well, one thing and what is our tradition? I guess I didn't define what our tradition is. That the tradition that I'm talking about is the Judeo-Christian tradition, specifically the Christian tradition, the Old and New Testaments, the church history, the creeds, the hymns, the worship practices and sacraments. Okay. Well, one thing that tradition teaches is the existence of an afterlife. Okay. So let me read 2 descriptions of the afterlife. In the book of Job Job says, "Let me alone that I may find a little comfort before I go, never to return to the land of gloom and deep darkness, the land of gloom, gloom and chaos, where the light is like darkness." And this is very much a ancient construct that the place of the dead is exactly that, a place of darkness, of minimal existence. There's another image in the tradition, and this is a little longer passage, and I'll apologize for that, but this is, you'll recognize it. And this is a parable of Jesus, and I'm just going to read an excerpt. "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was being tormented. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus at his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony.'" So this really describes kind of the traditional Christian description of the afterlife, a binary afterlife in which there is a blissful option and a tormenting option. But the existence of an afterlife is a given in the Christian tradition. Jesus' parable says there's something different, something added here, and this is the concept of judgment. So, one thing that has divided Christian traditions, sects, and denominations for centuries has been, what's the criteria for the verdict? What gets you to which place? We're not going to go through any of those things. But there's another piece of judgment that is in the tradition that I'd like to point out. And this has to do with judgment in the present that influences are dying. Here's the example from Proverbs 10:27. "The fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be cut short." And this is throughout the Hebrew scriptures, in the Psalms and in the Proverbs, and that if you're a righteous person, you will live. And if you're a wicked person, you will die. At least live, you will live longer if you're righteous, and you will die sooner if you're wicked. The teacher in Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books of the Bible because it's all questions, and I just love the questions. And in the 7th chapter of Ecclesiastes, the writer says, "In my vain life, I have seen everything. There are righteous people who perish in their righteousness, and there are wicked people who prolong their life in their evil doing." So the writer of Ecclesiastes says, well, I know the tradition says that if the righteous shall live longer and the wicked should die sooner, but as I look around, I see that that isn't the case. That the facts on the ground don't fit what my belief system tells me should be happening. We're going to come back to that concept a little bit when we talk about spiritual pain, because there's a little nugget of that right there, that I have been taught this and I want to believe this and I do believe this, but then when I look at the reality, that's not what happens. One more. And this one I love. So in Luke's gospel, reports some people coming up to Jesus and asking Jesus about a horrible event. Apparently, Pontius Pilate had killed some inhabitants of Galilee and had taken some of their blood and mixed it with this blood of the sacrifice to be offered in the temple. This is not a good thing. And they want Jesus to comment on it. And Jesus doesn't answer that question. But he goes on and he answers a different question. He says, "What do you think? They were more wicked because they got killed? Or those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them? Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? No." So Jesus said, it just isn't that way, that the tradition is wrong in this criteria, that sometimes stuff just happens. Okay. The tradition also teaches the sanctity of life, that humans are created in God's image somehow, that imbues each human with a sense of the sacred, with a piece of the sacred. Another concept in our tradition is that of stewardship. Paul says, "You are not your own, you're bought with a price." The quote I like the best is from the Brief Statement of Faith, which was developed in the 1980s by the Presbyterian Church, that starts, "In life and in death, we belong to God," that our life is given to us by God and that we are stewards of it and responsible for it. Another concept that I've mentioned in session 2 is the idea of the redemptive nature of suffering, that somehow going through trials, going through suffering is a purging process, creates purity, creates strength and spiritual maturity. The wilderness experiences of the prophets and of Jesus really speak to that. And then every hospice doc can say, "I don't have a clue what to do with this." And that is, the tradition teaches that miracles are possible. Not just that, but that miracles happen. How that plays out, we can think about. The hospice chaplains tend to say, when families pull out the miracle card, "I got nothing," because you can't argue against it. Yes, you can talk about, well, I wish and I hope that that happens, but we need to plan otherwise. And I'm going to throw one more thing out that is specifically in the Episcopal tradition. And these are some statements, some resolutions by the General Convention. In 1993, the General Convention created a document, a resolution that established principles with regard to the prolongation of life. And this is really a well thought through document that goes through the issues, specifically the principles, the theological principles, the sacramental issues that inform decisions made at the end of life, especially when one is thinking about those controversial end-of-life options that we talked about in session 2, and also less controversial ones with like withdrawing and withholding medical care. This was revised in 1994 to expand the paragraph that deals with intentionally shortening human life. And the chapter, the paragraph 2 in this document, if you want to read the whole document, as I mentioned, the links are in the handout. And well, let me just read it. That all human life is sacred, and that Jesus transforms, the resurrection of Jesus transforms death. Despite this hope, it is morally wrong and unacceptable to intentionally take a human life in order to relieve the suffering caused by incurable illness. This would include the intentional shortening of another person's life by the use of lethal dose of medication or poison, the use of lethal weapons, homicidal acts, and other forms of active euthanasia. Palliative treatment to relieve the pain of persons with progressive incurable illness, even if done with the knowledge that a hastened death may result, is consistent with the theological tenets regarding the sanctity of life. So this paragraph comes down and says that euthanasia, active euthanasia, that's not legal anywhere in the United States, is not a moral act. And it also says that aggressive palliative interventions like palliative sedation, which is legal in the United States, are appropriate. The issue of medical aid in dying is vague in this paragraph. And even though this was a 1994 revision, and this was before Oregon had started its medical aid in dying, its death with dignity program, but the wording was reaffirmed just over 10 years ago. I'll be interested to see where that goes. Okay, spiritual pain. You know what? I am going to stop sharing and tell a story here, if that's okay. This is a story about a little girl named Katie. And Katie was 6 years old when I got to know her. I got to know her because she always accompanied her mom to my oncology office. And I was treating her mom for widespread breast cancer. Katie's mom and dad were wonderful parents, and Katie was an amazing little girl. Everybody in the office fell in love with her. She'd love to come in and color. She would sit in the nurse's station and color and do little crafts while mom was getting her chemotherapy. Sometimes she would go watch TV with mom, but usually she sat in the nurse's station and ate cookies and colored. This trio, Katie's mom, Katie's dad, and Katie, shared a tremendous love. And they also shared a strong faith. Part of their faith was that Katie's mom was going to be healed. First, it was through the chemotherapy that I was giving. Then it was through the new and recently released chemotherapy. And then it was going to be through the bone marrow transplant that I referred Katie's mom to get. And then, well, then God was going to have to do it alone, because medical science had run out of things to do to make Katie's mom better. There was an evening after rounds, when I was on rounds in the hospital after office hours. Katie's mom was in the hospital. She was on a special mattress because if we moved her, we risked breaking bones and causing excruciating pain. Katie, I went in to see Katie's mom, and her mom was in the bed. Dad was at the bedside, and a pastor from the church was there. And we were going to have a tough conversation. And Katie's mom thought that maybe Katie shouldn't be there. So I took Katie out to the nurse's station, and this was back in the day when you could do that. And Katie was well trained in sitting in nurse's stations and coloring, and that's what she did. And I went in and talked with Katie's mom and dad. And it was clear to me that Katie's mother was in the last days to maybe weeks of her life. They listened to me respectfully, and they understood, and they trusted me as their doctor. But they continued to pray and claim in the name of Jesus that Katie's mom was going to be healed and was going to get up and walk out of that hospital a healthy and cured woman. That night, I was having trouble sleeping. This bothered me. This bothered me a good deal. And maybe because maybe I was too emotionally involved with Katie, I don't know. But it was a gripping situation. I had this image of Katie asking me, Dr. Jeff, isn't Jesus going to make my mommy better? I didn't know what Katie knew about living and dying and health and illness. I knew she knew what was going on. She was a smart little girl. She was a giving little girl. That evening at the hospital, before I sent her back into her mom's room, she looked at me. She must have seen something was going on inside of me, because she said, Doctor, I think you need a hug and a kiss and a pinch on the butt. And she did all three. And it was amazing. I'm sorry. But that night, I had the image of a little 6-year-old girl about to lose her mommy saying, isn't Jesus going to make my mommy better? And I didn't have an answer. Before I got to sleep, I got a thought that I guess let me sleep. An answer that said, sure, Katie, of course Jesus is going to make your mommy better. But you know, Katie, sometimes Jesus loves people so much that he makes them all better. So they never have to hurt again. They never have to be sick again. You know, I don't know if that answer would have worked for Katie, because she never asked me. But then that's okay, because I know it wasn't Katie that was asking. So, spiritual pain. This is a quote that I love. It's from a man called Samir Selmanovic, who, I Googled him, and he's an executive life coach. But I encountered him because he wrote an entry in one of the year 4 EFM texts. And this quote stands out to me. And Mr. Selmanovic said, when we can't fit our life experience into our religion, something has to give, and life can't give. This is what the writer of Ecclesiastes was saying, is I have a religion that says that good people live and bad people die, but the facts of life are that isn't true. And that is spiritual pain. That is one way of describing spiritual pain. When your belief system won't jibe with what you're experiencing. When your faith doesn't fit the facts. Okay. So, might this play out with that whole question of positive religious coping and continuing futile medical treatment? Well, there's a general American image of God that fits this. A God who determines how long we live, who judges us, deciding on our eternal reward or torment, and who is somehow, whether causing or allowing, but is somehow involved in the pain and suffering we endure. So how might this play out so that people don't choose to allow themselves to transition to what they believe is their reward? I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from my book because I thought about how to word it, and I probably can't word it better. So if this God is a benevolent, loving parent who accepts me despite my failings, I can feel assured that the choices God makes for me are trustworthy and will be the best for me. God's will, even if it includes severe suffering, will work for my good, and any pain I endure now will be compensated for with exceeding joy after I die. I don't want to limit the time that I have to receive more of the blessings that God has in store for me, and who knows, maybe that blessing will be a miraculous cure, and my staying alive might bring that miracle about. Or maybe this God is judgmental, one who knows every dreadful thing I have done, including those I've not told anyone. If I am suffering, it is either as punishment for what I have done, or else it's a test to see if I can measure up. Hopefully, I'll do well enough dealing with this trial to squeak by and avoid eternal damnation. But if I doubt or question the dogmas I've been taught, that's another point against me, so that I can't even think of going there or questioning. I need more time to show God how good I really am, and maybe after I've suffered long enough, God will cure me and give me another chance to do better. Okay. So what does this spiritual pain look like, either in that situation or something? Well, those going through spiritual pain tend to feel guilty. They know they're not good enough. They know that they have doubts. They wonder, is this all a crock? But I don't dare think about that, and so I feel guilty about doubting. But this whole situation just pisses me off. It makes me angry. Why am I going through this? I don't deserve this. What did I do that I'm going through this? And just leave me alone. I just don't want to talk with anybody about it. You've given me all these platitudes and answers, and they're not working, but I can't doubt them. But mainly, I am scared to death. I am scared to death. I'm afraid that I'm wrong, and I'm just as afraid that I'm right. Okay. So, that sounds awful. Religion can both inflict pain and provide the solace and meaning. When religion inflicts pain, it's when it gives answers rather than listens to questions. Answers that don't fit the questions don't help. This is another reason why, if you want to be present with someone who's going through pain, Just sit there and listen. Ask questions. Don't give advice or answers. The healing that happens stems from openness and vulnerability. The openness to explore for meaning and love that are the ultimate goal of the spiritual quest. And they might be found in your tradition, or they might be found somewhere else. This is one thing. My dad died on hospice care, and he declined to see the hospice chaplain. My dad had a very strong faith, and I don't believe he was going through any spiritual pain at all. We can talk about that another time. But it hurts me when I hear people say they don't want to see the chaplain, because the most common reason for not wanting to see the chaplain is anger or fear. And I just don't want to go there. Or certainty, which sets us up for increasing pain when that things that we are certain of don't tend to fit with our reality. The hospice chaplains are really trained and are experts in questioning and eliciting and listening and guiding in the search for meaning. And what is the antithesis of spiritual pain, the antithesis of that fear? Well, it's hope. Not wishing kind of hope, like I hope I win the lottery, but real hope, as in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection that is talked about in the burial service. Fear is the product of our brokenness, but hope is the assurance that whatever happens, we will be okay. In life and in death, we belong to God, and that is our sure and certain hope that we will be okay. Sometimes it takes time to find that hope, to get past all this stuff. Krista Tippett says, hope is the brokenhearted on the way to becoming wholehearted. I love that quote. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Thank you for putting up with my stumblings and my PowerPoints. I hope we can talk. Let me know if you have questions. Let me know if there are things you want specifically to talk about. And let's have some good conversations. And if we don't find answers, then at least maybe ask better questions and find a little peace. Be well, be happy, and thank you very much.